Does the Shroud of Turin have new evidence that proves it did belong to Jesus and proves the legitimacy of the resurrection? My response to a commenter who states that there now is, and gives me his source, so stay tuned and we'll see if this sends me to the waters of reconversion. On one of my videos months ago, I got a comment from someone who goes by the call sign Holy Smokes, obviously a Christian, possibly a fundamentalist, who stated there was indeed legitimacy for the New Testament and the resurrection of Christ. One point he had was the resurrection of Jesus confirmed by the Shroud of Turin, in which I commented back and said I thought that was settled in 1988, in which they found the shroud to be somewhere around the 13th century, give or take. And he stated no, there was much more new evidence that did indeed confirm the shroud's legitimacy of that belonging to Jesus himself. And he cited the work of a man named Barry Schwartz that I should look into. And then I thought, well, I really haven't read much about this since the 1990s, and thought I'd take his challenge and do an entire video of what I find concerning the legitimacy of the Shroud of Turin. Because as I've said many times, I'd love to be proven wrong, in which I'd head to reconvert at the baptismal waters. So I started with Barry Schwartz's work. Now, he was a member of the Shroud of Turin Research Project, commonly known as STURP, and he actually was a non-practicing Jew. His contention was that there did indeed have to be some interaction between the body in the shroud and the imprint that was on the cloth, because the specific instrument that they were using to assess the image on the cloth was designed to evaluate X-rays and would have produced a distorted image if it was just a photograph imprinted on the cloth itself, or something of the like. He thought possibly the image produced was beyond the scientific realm. But it's important to note that no way did Schwartz think that this was evidence of a resurrection. If an image was produced by such a radiation type effect, it would show an image of a living person, not a dead one. And he's still a non-practicing Jew from the last of what I read. So to the commenter Holy Smokes, my answer to the Schwartz source really doesn't prove much of anything. As a matter of fact, there's a Dr. Stephen Mattingly, who's a professor of microbiology and immunology at the University of Texas, who may have his doubts about the 1988 results, but states that bacteria could have colonized, creating a biofilm that imprinted a yellow image that slowly darkened over time on the cloth. And apparently, there are still a lot of debates about the Shroud of Turin. But the biggest debate seems to be the date of it in the 1988 results, largely because it's stated they took one piece of the cloth that wasn't part of the main image, and there seems to be three main theories why perhaps the carbon dating of 1988 wasn't accurate. Well, first of all, they did use three distinct laboratories, they did have two control samples each, and the reason the blind test was abandoned is because all the researchers would know which cloth was from the Shroud of Turin versus the other two that were already predated in advance. And all three laboratories put that date between 1260 and 1390 AD as the age of the cloth. But then came the three critique theories. One was the cloth contaminated by bacteria, and this one seems to be refuted. One Roger Sparks, a radiocarbon expert from New Zealand, said that an error of discrepancy of 13 centuries of the date of the shroud would have required a layer of bacteria that would double the weight of the sample. And that shroud was thoroughly examined at the National Science Foundation of Mass Spectrometry Center at the University of Nebraska, and it failed to detect this bioplastic layer on fibers from the image and non-image part of the cloth. Also, an organization called the Raman Spectroscopy at Instruments SA also failed to find this. There was even one Harry Gove, who had originally challenged the accuracy of the dating of the shroud, who admitted that 2/3 of the sample would have to consist of this bacterial layer to swing the result this much. So it seems like this first challenge has been refuted. The second one was contamination by reactive carbon. There was a Russian, Dmitry Kuznetsov, if I'm pronouncing that right, a chemist and archaeological biologist that claimed in 1994 to have reproduced the effect of catalyzing airborne carbon into the cloth from substances in the water when the cloth was doused in a previous fire. However, this scientist was actually arrested in 1997 in America for accepting bribes by magazine editors to produce this evidence. Others found his sources non-existent, and he has been proven that his experiments were never performed. As a matter of fact, Joel Donahue and Damon at the University of Arizona attempted to replicate this so-called carbon enriching treatment, and they found they were not capable of producing these claimed changes, thus nullifying the carbon enriching contamination theory. Now, the other contamination hypothesis that's been used by the defenders of the Shroud was contamination by the smoke itself in a previous fire. Would the carbon monoxide infiltration by smoke alter the testing of the carbon dating in 1988? Well, Christopher Ramsey, the director of the Oxford University Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit, researched this and found that it wouldn't alter the date more than a single year. He was involved in this study with John Jackson of the Turin Shroud Center of Colorado, and they completely refuted that theory. Now, as far as statistical analysis, in 1994, J.A. Kristen applied a strong statistical test to the radiocarbon data and concluded that the given age for the Shroud is, from a statistical point of view, correct. And I've also read that the most recent analysis concludes that the stated date range needs to be adjusted by up to 88 years in order to properly meet the requirement of 95% confidence, as was stated in the 1988 research. And I've read other opinions that conclude that there may be needed a greater fluctuation of years when determining the date of the Shroud of Turin, but I haven't read anything that states that they thought it was in Christ's time. So there'd really be three things we have to determine in determining whether the Shroud of Turin is evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. First of all, we'd have to pinpoint the Shroud's age of being in the time of Jesus. And it seems with every theory that's tried to do this, it has been refuted. Second, even if we found the Shroud of Turin did come from the time of Christ, we have to determine whether he actually was wrapped in it. For instance, a team by Elvio Carlino from Italy's National Research Council used wide-angle X-ray microscopy, a technique also mentioned by Dr. Liberato De Caro, and his team attempted to show that their methods proved that whoever was wrapped in the shroud suffered from multiple incidents of physical trauma. But you have to continue reading. That paper was retracted for not using sufficient controls and not having a competing factor in the experiment. And occasionally I do read things from the defenders of the Shroud of Turin belonging to Jesus Christ. And so far, they've all been refuted. And this is kind of my point, holy smokes. When a Christian, especially a Christian fundamentalist, wants to believe in something, he immediately points to a researcher who is congruent with his worldview. But that's where the Christian and Christian fundamentalists stop reading. Much like when a Christian fundamentalist explains the continents moving across the earth during the supposed Great Flood based on the work of geophysicist John Baumgartner in his theory of runaway subduction. It makes sense, so they stop there. Never mind that his research was completely refuted by his colleagues and pretty much everybody else. I do not find any evidence, and believe me, I read a lot of articles about this, way more than I intended in the creation of this video, with many pages of notes from these articles. And I do not find any substantial evidence that proves that this was the shroud of Jesus Christ, and definitely doesn't indicate or confirm that there was a resurrection by this man. But, like I say, the Christian can always comment, and I'll always research it, unless it's completely absurd. And if you'd like to delve into some other topics that I've debunked, from apologists' claims that they have proof of the resurrection of Jesus, check out my playlist card that will appear on the end screen of the video. And check out my tale of what I think it'd be like if Christ ever returned to Earth. The Armageddon the Evangelical never saw it coming. Links are on the video description as well as the banner, and I will see you next time when we once again take that sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.